There are places where the sacred and the profane silently touch, where the walls erected to protect faith and truth conceal what should never have been awakened. In the heart of the Vatican domains, amidst gardens that feign peace and corridors that echo ancient prayers, lies a convent that does not appear in official records, a convent where the nuns did not wear the white of purity, but the black of eternal mourning. This is the haunted Vatican convent that the Holy See has never acknowledged, but which lives on in the memory of those who dared to cross its threshold and return, transformed by horror. The story begins where the light hesitates to enter. On moonless nights when the silence of the Holy City becomes so dense it seems solid, some swear they hear chants. Not the Gregorian chants that uplift the soul, but distorted, inverted melodies that seem to come from throats that have forgotten how to pray. They are the voices of the Brotherhood of Ravens, a name never uttered in any papal document, but which whispers in the oldest confessionals, in the sealed letters that bishops burned without reading, in the diaries of priests who went mad trying to understand what they saw. The somber convent stood on an isolated property, connected to the Vatican gardens by tunnels ignored on official maps. Its architecture defied the standards of Catholic female orders. The windows were too narrow to allow the full entrance of divine light, and the cells, those who saw them said, had symbols engraved on the stones that belonged to no known liturgy. There, according to fragments of accounts that survived ecclesiastical censorship, lived women who had taken vows, but not the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that the Church preached. These were other oaths, pronounced at midnight, sealed with forbidden rituals that transformed prayer into invocation. The origin of the sisterhood remains shrouded in spiritual mist. Some apocryphal manuscripts suggest it arose from a heretical schism in the 17th century, when certain nuns began to question whether God truly heard their prayers, or if there were other, older and hungrier entities that responded more quickly. Other texts, burned but partially preserved in clandestine copies, speak of a Mother Superior who supposedly received visions, not of saints, but of ravens. Ravens that spoke in dead languages, that brought messages written in blood, that promised power to those willing to open the doors that faith kept closed. The sisterhood symbol was simple and terrifying. A black raven with outstretched wings, but with its chest hollowed out as if its heart had been ripped out. This emblem has never been found in any official Vatican records, but it appears in recurring nightmares of those who have studied the most serious cases of demonic possession linked to the region. The nuns who belonged to this order wore black habits without the traditional cross. In place of the cross discreetly embroidered over the heart was the heartless raven, a constant reminder that they had given up something essential in exchange for forbidden knowledge. At midnight, when the bells of St. Peter's Basilica fell silent after their last chime, another ritual began. Deep within the somber convent, black candles were lit. Not ordinary candles, but cylinders of wax mixed with ashes from burned sacred texts and herbs that grew only in ancient cemeteries. The light they produced was not golden or white, but a sickly red that made the shadows dance on the stone walls with a life of their own. The nuns descended in silent procession, barefoot on the icy floor, their faces hidden by veils so thick that it was impossible to distinguish human features beneath the fabric. The fragmented accounts that survived describe these nocturnal encounters with disturbing precision. The sisters formed a circle around an altar that shouldn't have existed. This altar, according to the descriptions, was made of black stone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, and was marked with symbols that combined inverted Christian iconography with characters from pagan languages predating Christianity. On the altar, a book, not the Holy Bible, but an untitled tome, whose pages, it was said, were made of a material that no scholar has been able to identify with certainty, but which some swore was human skin, prepared with techniques dating back to medieval heretical cults. What happened during these forbidden rituals remains largely hidden, protected by layers of secrecy and terror, but the fragments reveal enough to chill the blood. The nuns recited inverted prayers where sacred names were pronounced backward, creating sounds that made the air vibrate nauseatingly. They sang hymns in corrupted Latin, mixed with words from languages so ancient that even the linguists of the Apostolic Library could not translate them. And while they sang, something responded. Witnesses who peered through cracks in the walls, priests too young to understand the danger, Swiss guards patrolling too close, reported seeing shadows move independently of bodies. hearing voices that did not come from human throats, feeling a presence so oppressive that the air seemed to solidify in their lungs. Do you feel that what has been forgotten still calls to us? If this mystery has touched something within you, stay until the end. There is something you need to hear. Because the story of the Sisterhood of Ravens is not just about nuns who lost their way in faith. It's about what happens when the sacred is deliberately profaned, when those who should be guardians of the light decide to explore the darkness. It's about a convent where prayer became a curse, where spiritual fasting fed hungry entities, where seclusion did not protect from the world, but imprisoned something far worse within its walls. To understand how the Brotherhood of Ravens was born, it is necessary to go back to a time when the Vatican was facing crises that threatened the very foundations of the Catholic faith. It was a period of reforms and counter-reforms, of inquisition and heresies, of saints and witches burning on the same pyre. In this spiritual cauldron, where the line between devotion and fanaticism became increasingly blurred, there arose those who believed that God had become too distant, too silent, and that other voices, older, hungrier, offered quicker answers. The convent that would house the sisterhood began like any other, a place of spiritual retreat for noble women who wished to dedicate their lives to prayer. The founding mother, whose name was erased from all official records but whom some secret documents identify only as M, was known for her extreme devotion. She fasted for weeks, flagellated herself until her blood stained the stones of the chapel, and spent entire nights in vigil praying for divine revelations. The Holy See saw in her a candidate for sainthood, but what they did not see, or did not want to see, was that her prayers had begun to change direction. According to fragments of her personal diary, preserved in copies made by nuns who later fled the order, M began to receive visions after a particularly long night of fasting and prayer. But they were not visions of angels or saints. They were ravens, hundreds of them perched on the eaves of the chapel, watching her with eyes that shone with non-animal intelligence. And then, one of them spoke, not in Latin or Italian, but in a language that she somehow understood directly in her soul. The raven promised her knowledge that the priests hid, power that the bishops reserved only for themselves, direct access to the divine without the mediation of the male hierarchy that kept her subordinate. Herein lies the spiritual poison that contaminated the foundations of the sisterhood. M believed she had found an alternative path to the sacred, a secret way that the church deliberately concealed from women for fear of losing control. She began recruiting other nuns who shared her frustration with God's silence, her anger at female subordination, her desperate desire for direct and undeniable spiritual experiences. One by one, these women were initiated into practices that began as extreme variations of legitimate Catholic rituals, but which gradually distorted into something entirely different. The nightly rituals began almost innocently. Extra prayers, extended vigils, in-depth studies of mystical texts that bordered on heresy but were still technically Catholic. However, M had brought something to the convent that would change everything. A book. No one knows for sure how she obtained it. Some theories suggest it was a gift from a cardinal who secretly practiced occultism. Others that it was found in ancient excavations beneath the foundations of the Vatican. The book had no title on the cover, only the symbol of the heartless raven engraved in black gold. The pages of this tome contained detailed instructions for rituals that combined Catholic liturgical elements with pre-Christian pagan practices. There were prayers that, when recited backwards, supposedly opened spiritual portals. There were diagrams of mystical circles to be drawn with menstrual blood mixed with consecrated wine. There were lists of names, not of saints, but of entities inhabiting regions of the spiritual cosmos whose existence official theology denied. And there were promises, power to heal or curse, knowledge of future events, the ability to influence the living and communicate with the dead. M began conducting experiments. At first, they were small tests. Rituals to uncover secrets, prayers to influence the decisions of ecclesiastical superiors, invocations to induce prophetic dreams. And they worked. Or at least they seemed to work. The nuns who participated in these initial rituals reported powerful experiences, vivid visions, sensations of intense spiritual presence, impossible coincidences that seemed to confirm that something was answering their invocations. The success of these experiments was the seed of the total corruption that would follow. As M's confidence grew, the rituals became bolder, more transgressive. The chapel's traditional Catholic altar was replaced by a black stone altar. White candles gave way to candles made with impure wax. Consecrated hosts were deliberately desecrated, used in rituals that inverted the Eucharist. The crucifix was turned upside down during certain nighttime rituals. And with each transgression, with each sacred line deliberately crossed, something grew stronger. The nuns felt a growing power, a spiritual connection that was undeniably real, but which carried an increasingly oppressive weight, an increasingly dark presence. The church began to suspect. Priests who visited the convent reported strange sensations, unexplained cold, whispers that didn't come from a human mouth, shadows that moved independently. Some bishops received anonymous letters warning of heretical practices, but M was cunning. She maintained a facade of orthodox devotion during the day. The nuns attended regular masses, recited the rosary in public, and kept vows of silence that prevented suspicious conversations. Only at midnight, when the investigators slept, did the true worship begin. Each layer that is revealed brings another shadow. Keep watching. The veil has not yet fully lifted, because what began as a desperate search for authentic spiritual experience has transformed into something far darker. The Sisterhood of Ravens was no longer a group of heretical nuns. It had become a conduit for forces that Christian theology classified as demonic, and these forces, once invited, did not accept being easily dismissed. The convent had become a cage, but no one knew for sure who the prisoners were, the nuns or the entities they had invoked. The first signs that something terribly wrong was happening in the convent came from unlikely sources. It wasn't cardinals or inquisitors who detected the heresy, but ordinary people whose lives had collided with the shadowy orbit of the Raven Brotherhood. A gardener who tended the grounds began having recurring nightmares after digging near the convent walls. In his dreams, he saw pale hands emerging from the earth, trying to drag him down while female voices sang in languages that made his head ache. He mysteriously fell ill, wasted away within weeks, and on his deathbed whispered to the priest who was hearing his confession, "The sisters aren't praying, they're calling." A laundress collecting nuns' habits for cleaning found stains that wouldn't come off with holy water. Dark stains that, when touched, caused a painful tingling sensation that traveled up her arms. She took the habits to a priest experienced in cases of possession, who examined them and declared them impregned with evil presence. The priest tried burning the fabrics in a sacred bonfire, but the flames refused to consume them completely. Even after hours of combustion, charred remains retained the shape of the heartless raven embroidered on the chest. Documents discovered decades later in secret archives reveal that the Vatican received at least 7 official reports from priests who visited the convent and returned disturbed. One of them, Father Giuseppe, full name omitted in the archives, wrote a desperate letter to his bishop describing a night he spent staying at the convent. He woke up at 3 in the morning, the hour traditionally associated with the satanic inversion of the sacred hour of 3 o'clock, and heard chants coming from somewhere underground. He descended silently and found a door that shouldn't exist according to the official architectural plans. Through cracks in the wood, he saw the ritual. Father Giuseppe's account is one of the most detailed that has survived. He described how the nuns, completely dressed in black, formed a perfect circle around the dark stone altar. In the center of the altar was a chalice, but it contained no wine. It was a thick, dark liquid that seemed to absorb the light of the candles. The nuns recited in unison, but their voices were strangely out of sync, creating a multiple echo effect that made it seem as if hundreds of voices were responding instead of just 12. And then, Father Giuseppe saw something that would mark him forever. The shadows of the nuns on the wall moved independently of their bodies. While the women remained motionless, their shadows danced, contorted, and took on inhuman forms. He fled that same night, riding nonstop to Rome, and presented his report directly to the Holy Office. But his sanity was questioned. How could a respectable priest make such fantastic accusations against devout nuns? He was sent to a remote monastery for spiritual recovery. 3 months later, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but those who saw the body noticed something disturbing. His eyes remained open, fixed on something on the ceiling, and his expression was one of utter terror. And even stranger, on the palm of his right hand, etched into the skin like a burn, was the mark of the heartless raven, Other fragments of evidence emerged from unexpected sources. A young nun, Sister Teresa, managed to escape the sisterhood after 6 months of initiation. She sought refuge in a distant traditional convent, and under the protection of a compassionate Mother Superior, revealed her story. Teresa described how initiation into the Sisterhood of Ravens involved a 3-night ritual. On the first night, the initiate had to fast completely and spend the night in vigil meditating on a symbol, the heartless raven, until she began to see it with her eyes closed. On the second night, she had to recite inverted prayers until her own voice sounded strange and alien. And on the third night came the dark baptism. The baptism described by Teresa was a deliberate inversion of the Catholic sacrament. The initiate was led to an underground chamber where a small well of dark water awaited. This water, the veteran nun said, came from a deep aquifer beneath the foundations of the Vatican. Water that had never seen the sunlight. Water that flowed near ancient catacombs where early Christians and martyrs were buried, but also where, centuries before, pagan Romans held nocturnal cults to chthonic gods. The initiate was immersed 3 times in this icy water, but instead of the words of the Trinity, the Mother Superior pronounced other names, names that Teresa refused to repeat, saying only that hearing those words made her soul ache. After her baptism, Teresa reported disturbing changes. She began having involuntary visions. She saw crows everywhere, even where there were no birds. She heard whispers when she was alone, as if someone were speaking directly into her mind. And most terrifying of all, she realized she could influence events in small but undeniable ways. When she intensely wished for something to happen, that a specific sister be assigned to a certain task, that a visit be canceled, it somehow happened. The power was real, but it came at a price. She felt increasingly empty, as if something essential was being slowly drained from her soul. Teresa's escape was what finally forced the Vatican to act. She provided details too specific to ignore: the exact location of secret chambers, descriptions of ritual objects, even copies of pages she had memorized from the untitled book. The Holy See sent a discreet investigator, an experienced exorcist known only as Father Alessandro. He was to infiltrate the convent under the pretense of conducting a routine spiritual audit and report his findings directly to a trusted cardinal. Father Alessandro never completed his mission. He sent 3 coded letters during the first 2 weeks, confirming serious spiritual anomalies. The 4th letter, received exactly 14 days after his arrival, contained only one phrase in Latin: Corvus videt omnia, the raven sees everything. After that, silence. When a commission was finally sent to investigate his disappearance, they found Father Alessandro alive, but transformed. He was in the convent chapel, kneeling before the black stone altar, reciting prayers in a language no one recognized. His eyes, when they finally looked at the newcomers, were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire sclera, as if they had been filled with ink. Comment on what your instinct tells you. Is it faith, or is it fear? The deepest answers often come from silence. If the truth touches the invisible, leave a sign of light, a silent but powerful gesture. Because these witnesses to horror did not lie, their experiences, documented in official reports that the Vatican locked away, confirmed the impossible. The convent had become an intersection between the material world and something far darker, and the Brotherhood of Ravens was not simply practicing heresy. It was serving as a living portal for forces that the Church taught had been defeated and imprisoned for millennia. But what if they had never been defeated? What if they were merely waiting, hungry and patient for someone foolish or desperate enough to open the doors again? The decision over what to do with the cursed convent tore apart the Vatican hierarchy. On one side, conservative cardinals argued for immediate destruction, burning the building, exorcising the grounds, dispersing the surviving nuns to distant convents under perpetual observation, and burying all evidence under layers of secrecy. On the other side, a more pragmatic faction insisted that simply destroying the problem would not neutralize the awakened forces. They believed the sisterhood had opened something that needed to be ritually closed, following specific procedures, or the spiritual contagion would spread. While prelates debated in Vatican meeting rooms, the situation at the convent deteriorated. The nuns who remained, approximately 20 women who had completely devoted themselves to the rituals, no longer attempted to maintain pretensions of orthodoxy. During the day, they circulated through the corridors in sepulchral silence, their faces pale and expressions blank. At night, the rituals intensified. Swiss guards stationed on the property's boundaries reported increasingly disturbing phenomena. Crows gathering by the thousands on the rooftops, completely covering the structure until the convent disappeared under a black, pulsating mass of feathers and beaks. The collective cawing was so loud it could be heard for miles, a sound that made dogs howl and horses refuse to move forward. Within the walls, reality seemed to be unraveling. Priests who attempted preliminary exorcisms emerged traumatized, swearing that the laws of nature no longer applied to that space. Crucifixes turned on their own. Holy water boiled without a heat source. Rosaries broke spontaneously, beads rolling across the floor as if escaping from invisible hands. And the nuns, when confronted with sacred symbols, did not react with pain or fear like typical possessed individuals, but with something far more disturbing: absolute indifference, as if these sacred objects no longer held any power there. Mother Superior M, now completely transformed by what she had invoked, became the center of an oppressive presence that permeated every stone of the convent. Witnesses described her as simultaneously present and absent. Her physical body was there, but something looked through her eyes, something ancient and hungry that had never been human. She no longer slept, did not eat, did not utter words in Italian or Latin. When she spoke, rarely, it was always in the unknown language she had begun to use, a language that made listeners' ears bleed if they listened for too long. The Vatican finally assembled an elite team: 3 veteran exorcists with decades of experience in cases of demonic possession, 2 scholars of ancient manuscripts specializing in medieval heretical practices, and a bishop known for his unwavering faith and courage in confronting evil. They were authorized to do what was necessary to cleanse the convent, a deliberately vague expression that gave them latitude for extreme methods. Armed with sacred relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, water from the Jordan River, they entered the convent at dawn, hoping that the daylight would offer some spiritual advantage. The confrontation lasted 3 days and 3 nights, and nearly destroyed the men sent. The first day was dedicated to prayers for protection and establishing spiritual barriers. The exorcists drew sacred circles with consecrated salt, hung crucifixes on every door, sprinkled each room with holy water while reciting psalms of protection. But as night fell, they realized their defenses were useless. The nuns simply walked through the salt circles to no effect. The crosses fell from the walls on their own, and when they sprinkled holy water towards the women in black, the liquid never touched them. It evaporated into thin air, as if encountering an invisible barrier of intense heat. On the second day, they attempted direct exorcisms. They confronted M in the chapel, surrounding her with sacred relics while reciting the Ritual Romanum, the official exorcism rite of the Catholic Church. She listened to them in silence for an hour, 2, 3, and then she began to laugh. It wasn't human laughter. It was a sound that came from multiple throats simultaneously, as if dozens of different voices were laughing through her at the same time. The exorcists intensified their prayers, invoking ever more powerful names from the celestial hierarchy, but M remained impassive. And then she spoke, and all present understood the words despite them being spoken in the unknown language. "You have no authority here. I gave permission. The door is open." On the third night, a confrontation nearly cost the lives of all involved. The bishop decided to perform a desperate act, to bring the consecrated host, the very body of Christ according to Catholic theology, directly into M's presence, betting that not even the darkest forces could resist the Eucharistic power. He entered the chapel at midnight carrying the golden monstrance where the host shone white and pure. The nuns were in the midst of their ritual, singing and dancing around the black stone altar. When the bishop crossed the threshold with the sacrament, they all stopped simultaneously. What happened in the following minutes was never fully documented. The few reports that exist are fragmentary and contradictory. Some say a blinding light filled the chapel, others that absolute darkness fell like a heavy curtain, but all agree on the outcome. When sight returned, M was on the floor, convulsing violently. The other nuns had fallen like puppets with cut strings, and from the ceiling, the floor, the walls, crows poured forth, not real birds, but shadows of crows made of palpable darkness that flew in frantic circles before dissipating like smoke. The bishop stood long enough to pronounce a final blessing before collapsing. bleeding from his eyes and nose. M survived, but what survived in her was no longer entirely human. She would be transferred to a secret Vatican institution, a place that doesn't appear on maps, where impossible cases were kept under perpetual surveillance. As for the other nuns, some died that night, their hearts simply ceasing to beat. Others lost their sanity completely, spending the rest of their lives in catatonic silence. Only 3 regained something resembling lucidity, but they swore they still felt a presence whispering in their minds, promising to return. Those who remain until now bear the weight of the revelation. Which side of the veil would you choose? Belief or oblivion? Subscribe and walk with us. Each new video is a key, and each key opens another seal. Because the confrontation at the convent was not a clean victory, it was at best a draw. The forces invoked by the Sisterhood of Ravens were not destroyed or exorcised. They were simply forced to retreat, to wait. And waiting is something that eternal entities do very well. The convent was sealed, but the nuns had proven that the doors could be opened. And a door once opened never fully closes. There are details about the rituals of the Brotherhood of Ravens that were deliberately excluded from official reports, considered too dangerous to be fully documented. But fragments have leaked out over the centuries, in whispered confessions, in manuscripts burned but not completely destroyed, in recurring nightmares of exorcists who never fully recovered from what they witnessed. These fragments, pieced together like fragments of a dark mosaic, reveal the true nature of what happened at midnight in the haunted Vatican convent. The Sisterhood's central ritual, performed on specific nights aligned with pagan lunar calendars superimposed on the Catholic liturgical calendar, was called in the ciphered texts the inverted communion. This name was not metaphorical. The nuns had developed a ceremony that mirrored in every detail the Catholic Mass, but with deliberate inversions intended not to worship the divine, but to invoke its opposite. Where the Mass lifted the spirit toward the light, this ritual dragged it toward the depths. The preparation began hours beforehand. The nuns fasted from the previous sunset, but not out of devotion, out of ritual necessity. An empty stomach, ancient texts said, created a specific kind of hunger that wasn't merely physical. It was a hunger of the soul, an emptiness that facilitated the entry of external presences. They bathed in ice-cold water mixed with ashes from burnt bones, a baptism in reverse intended to wash away not sins but grace. And they donned their black habits in absolute silence, each ritualistic movement, each fold of fabric carrying esoteric meaning. At precisely midnight, as the bells of St. Peter's Basilica tolled 12 times in the distance, the procession began. The nuns descended in single file, barefoot over icy stones that had been marked with symbols, not the Christian symbols of protection, but characters from dead alphabets that some scholars have identified as variations of pagan runes, combined with letters from ancient Semitic languages. Each step down the path was accompanied by synchronized breathing, creating a rhythmic and hypnotic sound that seemed to make the air vibrate at frequencies that escaped normal perception. The ritual chamber was located at the deepest point of the convent, carved directly into the living rock beneath the foundations. It was a perfectly symmetrical circular space, with a vaulted ceiling forming a hemisphere that amplified sounds in a disturbing way. The walls were smooth, polished like a black mirror, reflecting the candlelight in a distorted manner that made the shadows dance with a life of their own. At the exact center of the circle was the black stone altar, not carved from blocks but a single monolith that seemed to have grown from the ground itself, as if the earth had vomited something solid and cold from its bowels. The candles used were unusual. Made by the nuns themselves on moonless nights, they contained ingredients that defied the logic of faith. Beeswax mixed with the fat of animals never baptized, wicks braided with the hair of women who had died in mortal sin without confession, scented with herbs that grew only in abandoned cemeteries, mandrake, belladonna, hemlock. When lit, these candles produced a blood-red flame that did not warm but cooled the surrounding air, and a thick smoke that did not rise but descended, accumulating at ground level like creeping mist. The untitled book was brought in procession, carried by M in a wooden box darkened by centuries of handling. This box was never opened in daylight. It was said that trying to do so resulted in instant blindness. Only in the red twilight of the ritual candles could the book be safely displayed. Its pages, when turned, produced a sound that was not the normal whisper of paper. but something closer to the tearing of fabric or the creaking of bones. And the characters written on them seemed to move subtly, rearranging themselves depending on who was looking, as if the text adapted to the reader instead of the other way around. The reading began. M, positioned before the altar with the book open on a black iron stand, recited in a voice that began human but gradually transformed. The words were in an unknown language, but their rhythm and cadence deliberately mirrored the structure of the Latin Tridentine Mass. The same number of syllables, the same poetic meter, but phonetically inverted. It was like hearing the Mass reflected in a sonic mirror. And the other nuns responded in chorus, their voices harmonizing in ways that created impossible chords, sounds that made the ears ring and the vision blur at the edges. The chalice was filled, but not with consecrated wine, with a liquid that the texts describe only as the extracted essence. Witnesses who survived the rituals mentioned that this liquid had a consistency thicker than wine, a color darker than blood, and emanated an odor that simultaneously attracted and repelled, sweet like fermented honey, but with a putrid undertone of decomposition. No one knows exactly how it was prepared, but veiled references suggest that it involved menstrual blood, wine from grapes that had never seen the sun, and something else, something that needed to be harvested from people in a specific state of spiritual despair. The host used was the ultimate blasphemy. The nuns had managed to obtain legitimately consecrated hosts during Catholic masses, hiding them instead of consuming them. These hosts, which Catholic theology considers literally the transubstantiated body of Christ, were then used in the inverted ritual, but not simply profaned by destruction, something far more terrible. They were reconsecrated through the reversed ritual, in a deliberate attempt to transform the most sacred into the most profane, to invert transubstantiation into a trans-abomination. The moment of inverted communion was the climax of the ritual. One by one, the nuns approached the altar. M raised the desecrated host immersed in the dark liquid, pronounced words that made the air seem to tear, and placed it on the tongue of the kneeling nun. And then it happened. Witnesses recount that, at the instant of communion, the nun's expression changed completely. Her eyes rolled back, becoming completely white. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and for a moment, just a moment, it was possible to see through her, as if her body became translucent, revealing not organs and bones, but something that seemed like living shadows writhing within the human form. This was the moment of union they sought, not union with the divine, but with the entities they had invoked through months and years of preparatory rituals. The nuns believed they were transcending the limitations of the flesh, opening themselves to higher forms of consciousness. But what was really happening, according to the exorcists who studied the case, was consensual mass possession. The entities that answered the sisterhood's calls were not spirits of wisdom or fallen angels willing to share forbidden knowledge. They were parasitic presences, non-human forms of consciousness that fed on the vital and spiritual energy of the nuns, using their bodies as anchors to manifest themselves in the material world. After communion, the nuns remained in an altered state for hours. They danced in impossible ways, their bodies contorting at angles that broke bones but which they didn't seem to notice. They sang in perfect unison without seeming to breathe, producing harmonies that made objects vibrate and crack. And they received visions, not divine prophecies but glimpses of alternative realities, of possible futures, of secrets kept by distant people. This knowledge did not come without a price. Each ritual left the nuns emptier, paler, more distant from their original humanity. The ritual only ended with the first ray of sunlight reaching the horizon, even though no sunlight actually penetrated the underground chamber. It was as if the invoked entities sensed the approach of day and withdrew, freeing the nuns from their direct influence. The women awoke on the stone floor, exhausted and wounded in ways they didn't remember suffering, but with their minds filled with knowledge they couldn't explain the origin of. And they all felt the same thing: hunger. An insatiable hunger that food never satisfied, because it wasn't physical hunger. It was the hunger of the entities that now partially inhabited them, hungry for more rituals, more openings, more opportunities for complete manifestation. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this rite. The simple act of seeing is participating. Leave your mark in the comments. That's how silence becomes community. Because the veiled ritual of the Brotherhood of Ravens wasn't simply heresy or disguised paganism. It was a deliberate and methodical attempt to build a bridge between spiritual dimensions that the very structure of reality kept separate for good reason. And for some terrible years in that forgotten convent in the Vatican's domain, the bridge was built. What it crossed left marks that never fully healed, echoes that still resonate in certain places, on certain nights, when ravens gather for no apparent reason and the air becomes thick with an invisible presence. The convent was sealed in a secret ceremony held at dawn on a day whose name is not recorded in the official Vatican calendars. Exorcists worked in shifts for weeks, layer upon layer of blessings and spiritual protections being woven around the cursed structure. Sacred symbols were engraved on every outer stone: crosses, early Christian fish, divine names in Hebrew and Latin. Relics were buried at the 4 cardinal points around the perimeter. Water from the Jordan River was sprinkled until the ground was soaked. And finally, the doors were sealed with Easter candle wax consecrated by the Pope himself, sealed with papal signets that carried curses of excommunication for anyone who tried to open them. But sealing a door doesn't destroy what's inside. Official records declared the convent deactivated for structural reasons, a technical lie that allowed the Church to avoid more complicated explanations. The surviving nuns were dispersed, sent to distant convents under false identities, with strict instructions never to reveal their origins. Documents were burned. Witnesses were silenced through vows of secrecy under penalty of excommunication. And slowly, very slowly, the story of the Sisterhood of the Ravens began to fade from institutional memory, becoming rumor, then legend, then near oblivion. Almost. Because there are things that collective memory cannot completely erase. Swiss guards patrolling near the sealed site, now disguised under dense vegetation and fences claiming danger of collapse, report disturbing experiences. On new moon nights, when the darkness is deepest, some swear they hear singing. Not loud, not clearly, but like a distant echo coming from far below the ground. And crows, always crows, gathering by the thousands in nearby trees, silently observing, as if waiting for something. There are also the inexplicable cases. Over the centuries since the sealing, some 23 women, a number documented in confidential Vatican medical files, spontaneously developed identical symptoms: recurring dreams of a dark convent, a compulsion to draw the symbol of the heartless raven, and the claim of hearing female voices singing in unknown languages. None of these women had prior knowledge of the sisterhood. They had no family or geographical connection to the original nuns. But all described the same visions with disturbing precision, as if accessing memories that were not their own. All were discreetly referred to spiritual retreats overseen by exorcists, and all eventually either recovered completely or went irreversibly insane. There was no middle ground. Scholars who gained access to the sealed archives, an extremely restricted circle requiring direct papal permission, have developed theories. Some believe that the entities invoked by the Brotherhood of Ravens were not actually expelled, only disconnected from their physical anchors. These entities, according to the theory, remained trapped in the location, awaiting an opportunity to find new hosts. Other theories suggest something more disturbing, that the ritual of inverted communion created a kind of spiritual mark on certain women over time, unconsciously preparing them to be future receptacles should the Brotherhood need to be reconstituted. There is also the mystery of the missing pages. When the convent's archives were confiscated, the official inventory listed the untitled book as containing 212 pages. But when it was finally opened under controlled conditions in the Vatican Secret Library, it contained only 193. 19 pages had disappeared, removed with surgical precision, so perfectly that it was impossible to determine when or where they had been. The most unsettling theory suggests that these pages never materially existed for everyone, that the book revealed itself differently depending on who opened it, and that the 19 missing pages contained the most powerful rituals, visible only to those already initiated into the secrets of the Brotherhood. If this theory is true, it means that the most dangerous knowledge was never truly confiscated. It means that someone, somewhere, may still possess it. Father Alessandro, the exorcist who was corrupted during the initial investigation, never fully recovered. He lived 42 more years after the incident, confined to a secret Vatican institution where impossible cases were kept. During this time, he alternated between periods of lucidity and trance. In his lucid moments, he was a tormented man, constantly praying for forgiveness, flagellating himself until he bled, fasting to the point of fainting. But in his trances, which occurred with disturbing lunar regularity, he spoke in an unknown language, wrote pages upon pages of characters that no one could decipher, and drew detailed maps of places that did not exist in any known cartography. Before dying, in one of his last lucid moments, Father Alessandro left a message recorded by a priest nurse who attended him. He said, in a weak but clear voice, "They are not dead. The sisters are not dead, because they were never just women. They were ideas, and ideas don't die. They fall asleep. And somewhere, sometime, when the conditions are right again, when despair and spiritual hunger reach the same critical point, the sisterhood will return, not with the same faces, but with the same purpose, because the raven always returns, always." This prophecy, if it can be called that, has haunted the few who know the whole story, because we live in an age of renewed spiritual hunger, a time when millions seek transcendent experiences outside traditional religious structures, experimenting with occult practices without fully understanding the dangers, opening doors they don't know how to close. And somewhere in the world, in unmonitored convents, in spiritual circles operating in the shadows of official institutions, there are whispers of women who dream of ravens, who draw symbols without knowing why, who feel a calling they can't name but recognize viscerally. The convent remains sealed. The Vatican's orders are clear. It must never be opened, never studied, never publicly remembered. But human orders, however sacred, have limited power over the spiritual world, and there are signs that the seal is weakening, not physically. The papal seals remain intact, but spiritually. Sensitive people who pass near the place report sudden nausea, visions of winged shadows, a feeling of being watched by thousands of invisible eyes. And the ravens continue to gather, in ever greater numbers, especially on dates that correspond to the Brotherhood's ancient ritual calendar. The question that lingers, unanswered and perhaps impossible to answer, is simple and terrifying. What will happen when the seal finally gives way? Because human seals, however powerful, are temporary. 100 years, 200, 500, on the scale of entities that exist outside of linear time, it's less than a blink of an eye. And when the last layer of spiritual protection wears away, when the last buried relic loses its power through sacred entropy, when the last exorcist who knows the specific rituals of containment dies without fully passing on the knowledge, what will emerge from that place of concentrated darkness? The journey continues. Subscribe and follow along. Each new episode is a flame lit in the darkness. Write in the comments what the silence told you today. Sometimes that's where the truth manifests itself, because the story of the Sisterhood of Ravens isn't just about the past. It's a warning about the future. It's a reminder that doors between worlds exist, that they can be opened, and that once opened, they leave permanent cracks in the fabric of reality. The nuns who became the Sisterhood weren't monsters. They were women desperate for authentic spiritual experience, for power in a world that denied them, for transcendence in a time of religious stagnation. Their tragedy wasn't desiring these things, but choosing the wrong path to achieve them. And in the end, the deeper question remains, was the haunted Vatican convent an anomaly, a unique historical accident, or was it a symptom of something greater, a localized manifestation of forces that have always been present, waiting only for the right moment and the right people to manifest themselves again? The ravens know. They always knew. And they continue watching, waiting, cawing their messages in a language that reason does not understand, but that some primitive part of the human soul recognizes as an ancient and terrible truth. The final revelation is this: the true horror of the Brotherhood of Ravens was not what they did, but what they proved was possible. They proved that the walls between sacred and profane are thinner than theology admits. They proved that sacred vows can be perverted into dark pacts. They proved that faith, when distorted, can open doors that should remain closed forever. And they proved that even in the most sacred places on earth, even under the very shadow of the Vatican, darkness can find cracks to enter and spaces to grow. The convent remains. The nuns are gone, but what they built remains. And on moonless nights, When the world sleeps and faith wavers, you can hear, if you are attentive, if you are open, the distant sound of wings beating, thousands of black wings, and a song, always the song. The Sisterhood of Ravens waits, not dead, but asleep, not forgotten, but veiled, awaiting the moment when someone, out of desperation or ambition or simple curiosity, will decide that the seals were placed too long ago, that the warnings are ancient superstitions, that no real danger can exist in such a small and forgotten place. And then, the doors will open again. You stayed until the end. That means something. Maybe you're just curious. Or maybe somewhere deep inside you there's recognition, a memory that isn't yours, a recurring dream about ravens, a symbol you draw without knowing why. If that's the case, know this: you are not alone. And this is not a curse, but a calling. To watch, to remember, to ensure history doesn't repeat itself. Because the greatest power against darkness is not denying it, but knowing it. And now you know. The Brotherhood of Ravens was real. The haunted convent exists. And the most effective guardian is the one who knows exactly what they are watching.